you. New Start, good morning. So wonderful to be with you. Many of you saw me be raised in this faith community, and it's always a delight to be with you and see what God is doing amongst you. Now, Greg made me sound awesome. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to burst that bubble just a little bit and lower your opinion of me, okay? I am an Old Testament scholar. I teach Old Testament studies at Mid-American Nazarene University in Kansas City, Kansas. And something that I found consistent, now that I've been in this world for a little while, but something I found consistent about all of us who are specifically in Old Testament studies is that we have some consistent personality traits. Some of those personality traits are we are kind of weird, we're a little bit socially awkward, and there is something about reading these obscure texts in the Old Testament that illustrate the fullness of human depravity that just make us a little bit quirky. We spend a lot of our time talking about death, violence, and sex. And I kid you not, I have not made it through an Old Testament course without at least mentioning all of those three in some capacity. We talk a lot about pain and suffering and tension. We tend to kind of like the horror genre. Maybe because it reminds us a little bit of Old Testament studies, but we're a little bit of a weird bunch. And in fact, the other day, I was watching a movie with my friends, and they introduced the villain as a doctor. And all of my friends were like, oh, they're telling us that he's a doctor because he's really intelligent. That's what they're trying to communicate. But for me, like, oh no, you have it completely wrong. That doctorate is what led him to become a villain. Okay? You can only spend so much time studying this like obscure little portion of knowledge before you just snap. Now, I don't know if I've reached that point. I'm probably going at some point, but we're just a little bit odd. So in light of all this, I think it's only appropriate that I begin by telling you a little bit of my story, and it begins in the context of a therapist office. This was, to be completely honest with you, one of the hardest parts of my entire life. I had just left a church because I was being bullied, and there was some betrayal that happened from the men in power at this particular church. And I left feeling completely diminished, completely depleted. And what I realized months later, that there would be these things that would happen in my daily life that would make me feel I was right back there experiencing those same things over and over again. There's something about chronic trauma that can sometimes be triggered in everyday relationships. And I realized that in my new job, I was constantly being triggered. And I realized after a while, like, there's something deeper going on here, and I need some help. It's like, I'm going to go to a therapist. Here's what's going to happen, though, okay? We're not going to do any of that childhood stuff. No, we're not going to do that, okay? I'm going to tell her a little bit of my story. She's going to give me some explanations of why this is happening. Then she's going to give me some good strategies. And then I'm going to, like, graduate therapy early. It's going to be awesome. Like, totally on the fast track for that. That's what I'm thinking. A year later, I'm still in therapy. Thankfully, did graduate finally. I don't know if you actually graduate, but finally did. Came to appreciate that process, but at first it was really hard. I remember sitting in my therapist's office and thinking, what is wrong with me? What is going on? And after our first few sessions, this is what my therapist told me. She said, Chris, you are really good at crying, and that is a superpower, and I will fight you on that. It's so true. I think the ability to feel pain and to be able to express that with tears is one of the best criticisms that maybe we can offer to this world, because tears are an indication that something is not right in the world, and we need God, and we need each other to fix it. So she said, that's a good thing that you cry a lot. Those of you who cry a lot, I see you. It's a superpower. But this is what she told me. She's like, but Chris, I think that you need to get angry. I immediately felt shame when she said that. Because for me, anger is an unchristian emotion. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm really good at being angry on behalf of other people. If there are people who are vulnerable or marginalized and they are experiencing injustice, I will fight on that. I will get angry with you. But there is something about my own personal story where I had a lot of shame about feeling anger. Like it wasn't something that I was allowed to feel, that it made me a bad person. I didn't know what to do. I didn't feel like I even had language to express this anger that apparently was embedded deep within me. I didn't have that language for it. And so being the Old Testament scholar that I am, I opened up my Bible to the book of Psalms. Because what I do know is that the book of Psalms is full of all of these prayers that express not just sorrow and hurt, but also rage, full unbridled rage. what I did is I started reading these prayers, and these prayers give me the language that I didn't know that I needed. And there was something about reading these prayers that were inspired by God that started to shape my theology. What I realized was that maybe I wasn't actually praying to the God that I thought that I believed in. Maybe my language wasn't reflective of who this God was. What I realized is that my prayers needed to reflect my belief in God. If I believed that God was the incarnate God who entered into my pain and my suffering with me, if I believed that God could handle the full range of my emotions, then why wasn't I encountering this very God in the context of prayer? Did I love God enough to tell him everything I was thinking and feeling, even those, what we might say, unsavory parts? Did I trust that God would still love me, even if I used this language for him? And through the process of praying the lament prayers, I realized that my praying was selective. I was only praying what it is that I thought that God could handle, which gives you an idea that I actually had a low theology of God. That's not the God I actually believe in, and my prayers needed to reflect that. Reading these Psalms completely changed the way that I interacted with God. What you see in the Old Testament is there is this very rich tradition called lament. We see this in the book of Psalms, probably most prolifically, but it's actually throughout the entire Old Testament. The prophets, especially, are going to utilize this form of lament. But for the ancient Jewish people and also for the early New Testament community, the first church, what they used for their prayer book and sometimes even their hymnal was the book of Psalms. When they would meet together, they would pray these psalms, they would sing some of these songs, and then they would also use them for their own personal worship. Now, what's interesting about the book of Psalms is that roughly 1/3 of the entire book, and those of you who have read Psalms know the Psalm is the largest book that we have in the Bible, 1/3 of those Psalms, or about 40%, are what are called lament. That is a lot of lament, 40%. Lament is basically the biblical response to suffering in the world. It is a way of using dialogue with God as a way of conveying some of these, what we in our American culture might consider darker emotions. Pain, suffering, shame, agony, rage as well. For Jesus, this is what he used. Whenever they would be worshiping together, he was embedded in this lament tradition. Now, some of these laments are what are called imprecatory. These particular laments are the angry ones, and these are the ones that I think brought healing into my life. One of my favorites was Psalm 109, and we'll get to that one here in a little bit. Read it, and then your opinion of me is going to go even lower, okay? In this particular psalm, it's raging against somebody who had authority and greatly betrayed this person, and I totally resonated with that one. Now, the providence of lament in the Old Testament tradition might be a surprise to us, specifically those of us who are in a white American culture. Those who are minorities, or those who are in the global South especially, they do lament very well. This is the language that they use. But it's interesting, in our American culture, specifically our white American culture, we typically don't do lament very much. But for the ancient people especially, this is what they did. And this is the way that Israel remained in covenant relationship with Yahweh, because they were being honest with God about what they were experiencing. For God's people, reading the book of Psalms became a means of faithfulness, specifically when they were in the context of something called exile. Whenever this group of people, specifically the Assyrians and the Babylonians, conquered Israel, they took them away as slaves into the land of Babylon, where they were stuck for years and years and years. And Psalms became the language that they used. And I'm wondering if perhaps in the same way, lament can be a gift to God's people today. We often do not know how to cry or vent our rage. I personally didn't. The wisdom of sorrow and grief is often foreign to us. But lament can teach us how to be present to our own darkness, how to sit in the depth of our pain and sorrow so that we can find God's presence and healing. In our periods of exile and alienation from God's presence, lament can perhaps be a tool to reorient us to God's presence. God invites our lament. God invites it from us. The lament tradition also reminds us that we worship a God who comes alongside us in our pain and suffering. We do not worship a God who is far in distance, but we worship a God who sees and hears and comes near. We worship a God who enters into our suffering with us. This is the life and ministry of what Jesus did, entered into suffering with people. And in fact, Jesus, who was deeply betrayed by his friends, who suffered under a government system that was a tyranny, even though he had all this betrayal, he used the lament tradition. Whenever Jesus was dying on the cross, this is how Matthew quotes him. Jesus says, my God, why are you forsaking me?" What Jesus is doing is he's actually quoting Psalm 22. And I find that fascinating, that Jesus could have used anything. Jesus could have used his own words, because he's God, after all, like nothing can top him. But instead, Jesus chose to use this lament tradition to fully express what it is that he was feeling. Jesus, shaped by the Old Testament's tradition of lament, demonstrates to us a God who enters into our human pain. Now, in order to help kind of personify the way that lament functions in the Old Testament, we're going to take a look at a sample today. We're going to take a look at Psalm 13, which is one of the smallest psalms that we have, but it's a lament psalm, and it has all of the different functions of psalm. Now, there are certain maybe patterns that we might see throughout all of the lament tradition. Psalm 13 is going to, like I said, have all of them, but not all of the laments in the book of Psalms actually are going to have all these different features. For instance, there's a Psalm 88 that is all lament, and it never has any praise. It's just all these complaining. Okay, so whenever we study Psalm 13, for example, we see all these different characteristics, these patterns. That'll help us when we look at other laments and notice, well, this one doesn't have this particular characteristic. I wonder why that is. Now, before we dive in, though, I also wanted to tell you a little bit about the process. Can you tell I'm a scholar? Here I'm telling you all these things up front. We're going to get to the case study here in a bit. But there's a specific process to these psalms. Okay, it is not just the content that teaches us, but it is also the process. Process is extremely important in these prayers. A lot of times what we might be tempted to do is to kind of glaze over all of the painful language and then jump to the end of Psalms where you typically have a proclamation of praise and trust. Okay, we're like, oh yeah, blah, blah, blah. Okay, yeah, praise, happy, great emotional language, right? We might have the tendency to skip it, but don't. There is a very intentional process, I would even argue a therapeutic process, to working through the entire Psalms and all of its components. It's going to lead us through some dark emotions, but we need to process those emotions because we can't arrive to a position of trust and praise until we have first dealt with some of the dark, shadowy parts of ourselves. Okay, now let me give you an example. I have a friend in psychology, and she told me that I think in the 1990s, a group of researchers in the Arctic Circle were trying to investigate polar bears and some of their habits. And what they did is they had to remove some of these polar bears to a different habitat. So what they did is they got their tranquilizers, they tranquilized all these polar bears, and then they moved these polar bears to a new location. Now here's where I got a little bit crazy, okay? Not crazy enough with polar bears, right? Here's where I get a little interesting from a psychological perspective. Whenever these polar bears woke up, they started to shake very, very violently. And in fact, maybe some of you who have pets, like whenever your pet is sleeping, their paws go like this, like they're running. The polar bears started doing that, acting like they were running. And they, from a neurological perspective, had no idea why these polar bears were reacting the way that they were. It was so strange. They called in these psychologists, and here's what the psychologists realized. The polar bears, even though they were now in a safe location, they still needed to process through all of that terror that they experienced whenever those researchers were approaching them. The way that they processed through that is they were going to run, they were in a flight mentality, and they still had to process through that flight response whenever they woke up. This is what the book of Psalms, specifically the lament tradition, does for us. It helps us process through those emotions. We have to. There's a really fascinating book called The Body Keeps the Score. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. This book talks about how your body holds in your emotions. Your body keeps track of it. So it's just an interesting mechanism that God created in us. And the Psalms help us release that emotions as we work through them. So as we work through Psalm 13, know that there is some hope at the end of it, but we aren't going to jump right through that because that would be bypassing the entire process. We're not just going to skip to the end. Hey, go ahead and if you have a Bible app or you have your Bibles open, go ahead and turn to Psalm 13. We also have it available for you up on the screen. Here's how Psalm 13 begins. It begins with an address, which is the first component we have of the Lament tradition. And the address is, "How long, O Lord?" Now, if you were to read the entire context of this psalm, this would actually be really ironic because the psalmist, which tradition says David, David is actually accusing God of being absent. You see that irony? God is absent, but yet he's going to address God. He's going to talk to God. This is the way that the psalmist is trying to be faithful. This word in Hebrew is Yahweh. How long, O Yahweh? Yahweh is the personal name for God in the Old Testament. It reveals intimacy. So really, what the lamenter is saying is, even though you feel far from me, I'm going to remind you and I'm going to remind myself of that intimate relationship that we have, because this relationship matters. This relationship matters to me. And in fact, by lamenting, I am trying to protect this relationship. I'm willing to go to bat for it. It also shows the intimacy, but it also shows some hierarchy. Even though I'm feeling this way, there's still a level of respect that is happening between God and me. Although we're going to see a little bit of that respect is going to diminish as the lamenter continues. But he asks this question, how long? We're going to do a little bit of Hebrew. You guys ready for that? Too bad, we're going to do it anyway. Hey, in Hebrew, what this phrase is ad ana. The psalmist throughout Psalm 13 mentions this phrase, how long, 4 times, which is more than it appears in the entire rest of the Old Testament. Ad ana, ad ana, ad ana. Ad ana is a Hebrew word. Ad means until. Ana means groan. In fact, this Hebrew word is an onomatopoeia. Maybe you hear it, ana, ad ana. It's groaning. He's saying groaning, groaning, groaning is prevalent through this language. How long, how long, how long? This repetition is important. Whenever you have repetition in the Old Testament, what the author is trying to remind us is the things that we might be in danger of forgetting. In other words, the lamenter is saying, this matters how I'm feeling. I am groaning, and I'm going to tell God 4 times how I feel about this groaning. This matters to God because it matters to me. That's why we have that repetition. Now, this question, ad ana, how long, is not a logical question. The psalmist isn't saying like, okay, how long, God? Are we talking like a few days? We're talking about a month? We're talking about a year? He's not interested in receiving an answer like that. What this question is not really a question, it's a protest. What the psalmist is saying is, how long? God, it has been long enough. In fact, it has been too long. And I demand that you act, and I demand that you do something about it. Because here I am groaning. How much longer are you going to make me do this? Okay? Here we have kind of a confrontation that the psalmist is saying. It's a protest. It's a critique of God's inaction. This is who I believe God is. I expect God to do something about this. A lot of times in the lament, we have all these questions that are asked of God. And these laments remind us that God can handle our questions. God can handle even some of our sassy emotions like we see here in Psalm 13. Some psalmists, most of the psalmists actually, they ask, why? Why is this happening? And it's an accusation of unfairness. Psalm 44 asks God why he appears to be sleeping. It's sarcastic. We know God doesn't sleep. Psalm 42 asks God why he allows the enemies to oppress him, saying that's not fair. You need to do something about that. These are all rhetorical, saying it's not fair. I don't want a logical, carefully constructed explanation. I just want you to do something about this. At its core, the biblical practice of lament is criticism. Grief is a signal that something is not right in the world, and we need God to intervene, and we need God to do something about it. After we have the address, we have the complaint. verses 1 and 2. Here's what it says. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? In laments, this complaint is the longest part, always the longest. That's why it's a lament. The laments, they have a lot of things to say about what's wrong with this world and what they want God to do about it. It presents distress before God, saying this is what's really going on. It's trying to provoke a God to act by using this very emotional language because they want to convince God, this is severe. I expect you to come and do something about that. And what's interesting about Psalm 13's complaint is they accuse God of forgetting. How long are you going to keep forgetting me? And we know God can't forget. In the biblical tradition, forgetfulness isn't absent-mindedness, maybe the way that we think about that. In the biblical tradition, forgetting is willingly disregarding something. So for instance, throughout the Old Testament, God often accuses the Israelites of forgetting the covenant. It's not like they just misplaced the covenant. It's that they're purposely choosing to ignore it. This is what the psalmist in Psalm 13 is accusing God. You are purposefully choosing not to look at me. This is how he feels, not what the reality is. And one thing we have to remember about the book of Psalms is this is human expression. Okay, this isn't necessarily about God, as it is humanity expressing what they feel about God. This is what's going on here. He's saying, God has forgotten me. And the reason why he says this is because the psalmist desperately wants to be seen by God. I wonder to an exiled people, or maybe to Jesus in the New Testament as they're reading this from the perspective of feeling alienated from God, how this would have given the language that they needed. And this type of language reminds us that we can boldly question God. And maybe that can be liberating for some of us. The questions and accusations that we have against God don't put our relationship with God in jeopardy. It's a way of being faithful in the middle of that feelings that we might be having. Now, after he accuses God of hiding his face, of bearing, he talks about bearing this pain in his soul. Some translations say, how long will my thoughts consume me? Or this idea that I have very painful thoughts and I can't stop thinking about it. And then he also mentions, how long will my enemy be exalted over me? In this particular psalm, he mentions two different threats. He has internal threats, the thoughts and the feelings that he has that just don't seem to go away. And then he also has these external threats, this enemy. And we'll get to that in a bit. What the psalmist is saying is, since these are my enemies, my thoughts, that won't go away, and these physical enemies it seems like I have, because they are my enemies, he's saying these are also God's enemies. God wants to bring me into full wholeness. And this is preventing me. So I expect God to intervene and do something about this to bring me into wholeness. Now, maybe you notice reading this, though, that the lamenter doesn't really have anything specific. It's kind of vague. Did you guys notice that? Okay, that's purposeful, because this is a means by which that we can also pray with some of this ambiguity. This means that we can put ourselves in this psalm and we can see how this might be affecting us as well. We can use this as language to give meaning to what it is that we might be experiencing. It's purposely stylized that way so that we can use our prayerful imagination as we encounter this particular psalm. Some of this language you might not relate with. You might not have restless thoughts over and over again. You might not have physical enemies, but this psalm is an invitation for you to pray on behalf of other people who might be experiencing that. Hey, this psalm invites us to help us name social evils that all of God's people might be experiencing. They connect us to our neighbor and maybe the struggles it is that they have. It helps us, like I said, with our prayerful imagination, where we can stand in solidarity with people who might be suffering with things that we don't personally experience. Those threats are things we bring before God with prayer. Now, let me add a little caveat. As somebody who sometimes struggles with social anxiety, that we do bring prayer whenever we experience some of those thoughts or some of those restless feelings that we have. But we also have other means of grace too. Praying is a means of grace. But seeing a therapist like I did is also a means of grace. Medication is also a means of grace. All those are gifts from God, one of which is prayer here. Now let's talk about that enemy language, right? This enemy language, okay. When I first started reading this, I felt so guilty. I was like, I can really talk about my enemies whenever I'm reading some of these prayers. It didn't feel right. I think to us as maybe modern readers, talking about enemies feels unchristian, maybe is what I should say. Because aren't we as followers of Christ not supposed to have enemies? But friends, there is so much enemy language in the book of Psalms. In fact, enemy is one of the number one reoccurring words in the entire book. That and the poor are prolific throughout the book of Psalms. But some of these enemy language are like, oh my goodness, this is a little bit intense. So for instance, Psalm 137. Oh man, you guys, I don't think we're prepared for that this morning. Psalm 137 is a prayer of God's people in exile. And it is very violently asking God to eliminate their enemies. And they use very violent language, specifically even saying God, take their little ones and dash them against stones. That's how mad I am. Woo, right? That's a bit intense. I mentioned Psalm 109 earlier. That was my personal favorite as I was praying and trying to process some of my emotions. Psalm 109 talks about God stripping a man from his position of power, making his wife a widow and his children orphans, and then erasing their name from all of history. It's pretty intense language. Now, some of my colleagues in Old Testament argue that for those of us who are followers of Christ, that this should not be the language that we use, that this is permissible then, this is prior to Jesus, but now since we have the full revelation of God's Son, that this isn't language that we should use. Now, I understand where they're coming from, and I very much deeply respect that position. Now, this is my opinion. You can take it or leave it. I think that there might still be something to this enemy language. I think that this enemy language in Psalms demonstrates that there is no emotion and no thought that is off limit from God, that we can even take some of the hateful feelings or language that we might have about people as a means by which that God can change our hearts about these particular people. The enemy language is honest, isn't it? It's not putting up a pretense, not trying to be holier than thou. It's saying, God, this is actually what's going on here, and I want you to see this because I think that you can also do something about this. I think this enemy language in the book of Psalms also illustrates to us just how hard it is to love our enemies. And friends, the only way that we can learn to love our enemies is by first acknowledging that we have them. In order to love our enemies, we first have to acknowledge that we have them. If we aren't willing to acknowledge that we have them, everything's okay, I'm okay with this person, we're breeding dishonesty and inauthenticity, which are two things that are actually, I would say, antithetical to it is that Jesus is. Being honest about our hatred puts us in a position whereby God can change us and change our hearts. Now, what's interesting, though, about this enemy language is ultimately the psalmist always leaves it in the hands of God. I have this enemy, I want you to do something about that. The psalmist never says, I'm going to go take care of it, I'm going to enact vengeance. They always understand that vengeance belongs to God. God is the God of justice who is going to make all things right, and we can trust him to handle all of our enemies that we might have, both internal and also external. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a college professor, and during one of my classes on the Psalms and wisdom literature, I could tell one of my students in particular was getting very uncomfortable with all of this complaining. Maybe some of you are like me and you grew up thinking complaining was a bad thing. You're like, this is not necessarily a Christian response to what is happening. And this student, finally, she raised her hand and she says, Professor Bohn, how is complaining, how are these laments the fruit of the Spirit? Like, what a great question. You know, the fruit of the Spirit, Galatians 5, fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. I had to think about it for a moment, but this is what I told her. I said, I think that lament is an example of faithfulness. It's a way of being committed to God, even when we might be experiencing some very raw, full emotions. Perhaps choosing not to complain is actually the unchristian response, because avoiding or ignoring our pain breeds dishonesty and inauthenticity. But meeting God in the context of the fullness of our humanity is an act of faithfulness. The language of complaint teaches God's people how to speak the truth about our collective human emotion, and specifically in the presence of Yahweh. Now, after that lengthy complaint, we move on to something that is called the petition. Here's the petition. It says, "Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death, and my enemy will say, I have prevailed, and my foes will rejoice because I am shaken." Now, what this psalmist is doing next is actually extremely bold, is he's telling God what God needs to do. You don't do that, but this is what the psalmist is doing. He's like, okay, God, if you are the God I believe in, this is what I believe about you, and I think that you're going to do this. You're going to answer me. You're going to give light to my eyes. You're going to say to my enemy, okay, you're going to come and make this situation right. The psalmist, by saying these things, is also implicitly accusing God of being ungodlike. He says, God, if you are the God I believe in, then I expect you to do what God does. In some ways, the psalmist is holding, in his perspective, holding God accountable. And what the psalmist does is he recalls what God has done in the past as a means of calling for God's consistency. He says, this is what I know about you. This is what you have done before. You have always been faithful to me. You have always answered me. And so I'm going to trust that you're going to do that again. In some ways, this petition is also a revelation of trust, isn't it? He's saying, I want my prayer to be consistent with my theology, that what I believe about God is what I'm going to hold God to. Maybe some of you who are parents who have extensively worked with children have heard this phrase, do it again. Now, if you're like me, you get tired of doing it again. I volunteer with preschoolers at my church back home, and frequently you do the most mundane thing, and the kids say, do it again, do it again, do it again, right? Because kids understand, I know you are capable of doing this. I have a track record of you doing this. I expect that you will, again, do it again. I wonder if maybe we can have the same response to God. That all of us have our own stories and this beautiful experience that we have with God and the ways that God has been faithful and the ways that God has come through. So maybe what the psalmist is saying is that we can ask God to do it again. In Hebrews 4:16, this is what the author says, "Let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." We can approach God with confidence that God will be who God says that God is. The God who has been faithful in the past will continue to be present to us in the presence. Even though I get tired, whenever kids tell me do it again, God never gets tired. God will always do it again because God loves us and meets us where we are. Finally, the psalmist transitions to something different. Verse 5, this is what the psalmist now says. This is a response of trust. It says, "But I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation." Now here's where we finally get to a transition here. We've had the address, we've had the complaint, we've had the petition. Now we have this expression of trust. I want you to notice, though, it's only after expressing the pain that now the psalmist can come to a position of trust. I want you to notice also that in Psalms 13, none of the circumstances have changed in the psalmist's life. There is no indication that those enemies have been vanquished. There's no indication that this psalmist doesn't still feel all of those horrible thoughts that are restless within his mind. Even still, in the middle of those horrible things, the psalmist still says, "But I will still trust in you." As counterintuitive as it may seem, lament can help move us into a posture of trust. Expressing our grief, fear, sorrow, and rage can guide us into the trust of the one who enters into our pain with us. But just as the case with all psalms, specifically all lament psalms, there's always a tension between the complaint and the trust. It doesn't have to be either or. It can be both and. Sometimes we might want to get rid of that tension and be like, oh, it's all trust now. No. He's like, I still feel these things, but also this. It's both. We have to hold that tension in our hands as we read this psalm. And then finally, here's the nice part here, verse 6. This is how Psalm 13 ends. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. This is the praise section. Now, not always do laments actually have this praise section. As I mentioned, Psalm 88 does not. That's okay too, because it seems like maybe the person in Psalm 88 wasn't able to get to that point. And that's still inspired by God, and God still honors that position that the psalmist has. But here in Psalm 13, he arrives to a point of praise. Once again, this helps us view grief and thanksgiving and tension, that we can do both at the same time. It's not one or the other. Now, for some of us, sometimes after working through, for instance, Psalm 13, we might be able to arrive into a natural flow of an expression of trust and an expression of praise. Sometimes we can arrive there pretty quickly. But other times, we might not be able to cross over from lament to trust and praise, and that's okay. The psalmist never tells us how long it took him before he got to that position. We might, as we read Psalm 13, we might read verses 1 through 4 over and over and over again because we aren't able just yet to arrive at a position of trust. That is okay. There's no timestamp for how long that takes. There's no dictation of how fast it is that we need to move. We can't speed that process. Once again, there's something intentional about slowly moving us. For me, personally, during my times of laments, sometimes I feel like I can pray these things, sometimes I don't, and so I don't. I just stop at verse 4 and understand that when I'm ready, I'm going to come back and I'm going to read verses 5 and 6. But sometimes what I also do is I read verses 5 and 6 even when I don't feel it, because I believe that there is something life-transforming that God can do by reading this prayer and letting this prayer be kind of standing in for me, even when I don't feel like I have it just yet. What I've realized is I can borrow this language even though I don't feel it and understand and trust that God is going to shape me through it. But the most important thing I can do is I can just keep showing up, even when I feel like it, even when I don't, and using this language as a means by which to encounter God's presence. Now, Psalm 13 was just one little sample, but I hope it gives us just an idea of how prominent the lament tradition was for God's people all throughout their entire history. Because God's people have always struggled with God. The psalmists are going to struggle with God's goodness. We see that here in Psalm 13. The prophets, who are my people, they struggle with God's justice. They say, why would you let all these bad things happen? Is that really fair? The exiles struggle with God's promises. There is a lot of struggle throughout the Old Testament because God's people are always struggling and wrestling with God. And in fact, one of the stories that has shaped Israel's identity the most is Genesis chapter 32. In this chapter, Jacob literally wrestles with a man who he later finds out is actually God. In response to that story, God changes Jacob's name to Israel, which is where we get the name for God's people. Israel. In Hebrew, Israel means one who wrestles with God. In other words, God's full identity, even starting from all the way back then, has always been, we are a people who fight with God. We are a people who enter into that boxing match, and we fight because we believe God can handle it, and it matters to us, and it's going to matter to God as well. Because God's people have always understood themselves as wrestling and fighting with God, they use this language in order to give a resource for how it is that they were wrestling with God. And I'm wondering if maybe giving voice to our pain and suffering indicates to God that we too want to stay locked in this battle. We too want to be committed and faithful. We too hope that God is going to intervene and that God can bring newness and restoration to our own lives and to the world. Now, friends, as we close, we're going to wrestle with God just a little bit. I'm going to lead you through a guided prayer. I'm going to invite the band to come up while we do this here. And I'm just going to acknowledge that this might be a little bit uncomfortable for some of us in this room, and that's okay. It's okay if you feel uncomfortable. Sometimes standing in silence with God can feel a little bit disorienting, and maybe some of this language will make us uncomfortable. Just stick with it. Just stick with it. Okay, I invite you to. We're going to use Psalm 13 as a guide for prayer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause after each section, and I'm going to give you some prompts to help you compose your own lament. Maybe to give some of your own personal words to what it is that you might be presently experiencing. And in this way, we can use a lament tradition to dialogue with God this morning. So I'm going to invite you, if you are comfortable, go ahead and close your eyes. What I like to do is I like to put both feet on the floor as a way of reminding myself that I am here, physically present, right here in this body, right here in this space. God is going to meet me right here. And I'm going to invite you to take a long, deep breath through your nose. Go ahead and exhale through your mouth. Remembering that God is as close to you as the air you're breathing. Go ahead and do that again. Go ahead and breathe in. Breathe out. Let's begin. Let's begin with our address. What is a name for God that suitably expresses your present relationship that you have? Not the one that you want, not the one that you think you should have, but what is God like to you right now? Maybe you want to use Yahweh, like Psalm 13. Maybe you want to use another name for God. What are some questions that you have for God? Remember that your questions don't need to be logical. Your questions can be rhetorical. They can even be a protest. I'm going to invite you, as uncomfortable it might feel today, to do some complaining. Lament is complaining in God's presence, and God invites this. What have been the patterns of your thoughts and emotions lately? What has been troubling you? What is something that keeps creeping up? Who or what do you currently see as an enemy? And what would you like to tell God about this enemy? If you personally don't feel like you have enemies today, I invite you to pray on behalf of others in this room who do. And as we enter into petition, how would you like God to intervene? What do you think, based on your prior experiences with God, God should be expected to do? Trusting in the God who loves you, list a few beliefs you have about God, and give God reasons why you expect God to act based on God's faithfulness in the past. And finally, if you are ready to move into response of praise and trust, remember how God has been good to you. How can your heart rejoice? But if you are not ready to move into responsive praise and trust, try praying the Psalms response, even if your heart doesn't believe it yet. God, we thank you for being the God who hears us and doesn't run away from our pain and suffering, but chooses to come near to us and enters into our suffering with us. God, some of us might not be able to voice what it is that we may be feeling right now, but we remember, as we saw in Psalm 13, that even our groans can convey meaning. God, I ask that you would be with us in our groaning. Maybe the things that we feel are out of our control and we can't do anything about them and we feel helpless. And that you remind us that you're a God who is here and you're a God who wants to act on our behalf. God, I ask that in the middle of tension between lament and praise and grieving and thanksgiving, that you help us to remember that we can bring all of our full experience to you. All of our questions matter, the things we experience matter, because they matter to you as well, God. God, I ask that you would continue to shape us into the people you've created us to be through our prayers, that would remember our global church and the things that all of your people experience, and that we would remember to hold that tension tightly, not to resolve the tension, but to hold it and trust that you will meet us exactly where we are. We love you so much, God. Amen.